Hello everyone, this is Kat and welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfic. This is the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 44, chapter 44, entitled All's Hell That Ends Hell. There was nothing Midoriya or Aizawa or Yamada could do to change the fact that there was only a day of buffer before classes resumed as normal. That's how Nezu had planned it, and no amount of potential sway Aizawa or Yamada might have as teachers was going to change that, despite however they felt personally. Though that didn't stop them from trying their best to make Midoriya's only buffer day actually feel like a breath of fresh air. Breakfast, still fresh and hot, was waiting for him on the table, regardless of the fact that he woke up much later than normal, and both heroes enjoyed it with him, regardless of whether they had already eaten earlier. They didn't push him to do anything strenuous, regardless of whether it was in his best interest to skip his usual training. They didn't complain when all he wanted to do was nothing at all, or when his eyes suddenly gathered water equal to the weight on his shoulders, or when he begged them not to turn on the television, regardless of how awkward it kept the space. It was a slow day, full of soft-spoken comforts and gradual adjustments, and every time worry threatened to consume him, both Aizawa and Yamada were right at his side, holding him in the same way he'd imagined his mother used to. It was incredibly fulfilling, in a way that he could only describe with Kami in mind, except now it was no longer just the two of them, and it no longer had to be. Which is why he felt incredibly selfish, camping out in the school bathroom right as class was about to start. Aizawa and Yamada had insisted on walking with him to school, which wasn't a bad thing on its own. He quite enjoyed being around the two, especially since they knew and didn't mind him commenting to Gami on occasion. The feeling he had with them all together had to be what family was like, and it almost made him jealous that it had taken him so long to find it. But walking to UA with the heroes had meant he had gotten to class first, as usual. Unlike usual, however, the thought of his classmates slowly filling the space, all excited after coming back from their thankfully tame internship experiences, all knowing exactly how his went because of the news stories flooding the media, filled him with a dread he hadn't felt in a long time, which naturally left him hiding out in the bathroom just down the hall, with absolutely no plan on how he was going to get himself back to a class, and a thought that left him with infinitely more dread than the situation before. "Class is going to begin soon," Gami reiterated like he didn't already know that. "You cannot just stay in here." I know, but he wanted to go home. He wanted to be back in the comfort that was Aizawa and Yamada's arms. He wanted to go back to yesterday, when he was so sure that nothing could hurt him, because it was enough, as selfish as that was to admit. As thoughtful as yesterday had all been, he could only think about how one day just wasn't enough. Now he was thrown back into the endless ocean of death and all the responsibility that came with it. And he could only wish that things would go back to yesterday, when everything was so wonderfully mundane. Midoriya sighed, dropping his shoulders in defeat. The fear was familiar to his heart, but he wasn't going to make the same mistakes as he had that night in the alley. "You're right." Kami was always right. "We should go." The teen opened the bathroom door, with bated breath, even after Gami had confirmed that there was no one waiting outside for him, and no one that could run into him in the hall. The bathroom really wasn't that far from his classroom, but each step he took felt heavy, like wading through a sea of mud. His mind just couldn't stop racing. Everyone would be in there. Everyone knew how it went, that the hero killer had attacked him and Todoroki Niita in the darkness of a lonely alley, and it was only by a miracle that Endeavor had managed to come in time to save them. That was exactly how it went, and everyone would ask him about it anyway, which alone made his stomach churn, thinking about how it went and how it actually happened. It was pitiful for him to be so afflicted by this when he'd been the safest out of all of them, when Todoroki Niita had it so much worse that night, and that, the disappointment in himself, was enough to overpower the discomfort brewing in his gut. He reached out and pulled open the door to the 1A classroom. The wall of noise that hit him was nearly overpowered all by his volatile emotions. There was so much laughter and chatter, he could almost taste the bile clawing up his throat at how absolutely carefree everyone else was. But he couldn't really see any of the laughter or chatter, because Ida and Todoroki stood directly in front of the doorway, blocking his view of anyone and anyone's view of him. "Shoto, Ida," he whispered, like they'd disappear, holding back the trickle of tears threatening to burst free. He hadn't seen either of them since being checked out of the hospital, and though they'd stayed attached at the hip through their phones, seeing them in person again sparked a whole new level of relief that Midoriya wasn't sure had left him that fateful night. His friends seemed to relax visibly upon seeing him, too. Todoroki stepped forward, gently placing a hand on his shoulder just to confirm he was really there. "We saw your stuff in here when we came, and figured that you'd stepped out for a moment. We didn't want you to get bombarded when you came back." Ida gestured to the back of the room where Todoroki and Midoriya's desks were. Let's move back there. Someone is going to notice us if we stay here. They all soured a little at the thought and wasted no time retreating to the back of the room successfully, and Todoroki sat down brazenly at his desk, with seemingly no issue facing most of the class, regardless of whether they realized it amongst their liveliness. Still, Ida and Midoriya stood in front of him, placing their backs to everyone and creating a makeshift wall to block out everything but the three of them. Midoriya was the first to speak. How are you all feeling? Practically good as new, other than my hand, Ida spoke softly, holding his palm open. And even that isn't too bad. We should be asking you that, Todoroki scoffed, though his tone was more playful than anything. Midoriya huffed lightly with him, a small smile growing on his cheeks. Well, I'm off my crutch, so I'd say I'm doing pretty all right. He left out the part where Recovery Girl had paid an impromptu visit, courtesy of Aizawa yesterday. She was fairly upset at his reckless behavior, but something told him she was just as happy to see him safe as he was to see her. You healed quickly, Todoroki remarked. That's good, I'm glad. Me too, Ida smiled, however worn it was. Me too. You three! The sudden shout startled the trio out of their conversation, drawing the attention toward the group of their peers, slowly building near them. Sero, currently held in the grip of Bakugo alongside Kirishima, Midoriya didn't even want to know, pointed at them. Dude, yeah, the hero killer! Midoriya shifted in very obvious discomfort. Ida had stepped closer to him in response. Gami, who'd been silent throughout the whole ordeal, instantly brought the temperature down a few degrees. I'm so happy you're all alive. No joke, that's the most important thing, Kirishima piped up. They say you got rescued by Endeavor. That's the number 2 hero for you. Midoriya couldn't help the nervous side glance he shot at Todoroki, trying to share comfort through his eyes. One of his hands had trailed back unconsciously to rest on the desk. Todoroki looked down, his hand just barely creeping up to meet Midoriya's, in the most defeated of touches. Yeah. Rescued. That's exactly how it went, but only the three of them would know how it really happened. I saw it on the news, Ojiro commented. Something about the hero killer and the villain alliance being connected? Ojiro continued saying something else, but all Midoriya could hear was the echo of a raspy voice he was begging to forget. See you soon, Midoriya Izuku. Gami had touched him gently on his back, and the resulting shiver had snapped him out of his own head. Kaminari, who was sitting at his desk, turned around to contribute. He was pretty scary, but did you watch the video, Ojiro? That shouldn't have surprised the trio, but they all still visibly tensed at the realization. Midoriya guessed they'd all been avoiding the news, and for good reason. I don't know if it was his single-track mind or tenacity or whatever. Kaminari spoke so casually, so carelessly, throwing out words with no thought as to the weight behind them. But didn't you think he was kind of cool? Everything froze. Or maybe it didn't. Midoriya couldn't tell with the ice running through his blood, but regardless, he was rooted to the floor, trapped under his own skin like he was paralyzed by the hero killer's quirk all over again. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught Ida flinch and curl his left hand at his side. Unconsciously, they both had nudged closer to Todoroki's desk, seeking out the same comfort that they shared in the hospital room together. Todoroki, however, didn't hide his discomfort, breathing out a heavy, aggressive scoff that seemed to slap the sense back into his classmate. Ah, shit. Kaminari covered his mouth instinctually. My bad. Solemnly, Ida raised his left hand to look at it, watching his fingers twitch ever so slightly. No, it's all right. He was certainly a man of conviction, so I understand if people find him cool. Midori wanted to yell. It wasn't all right. Nothing about what happened that night was okay. However, he chose to advance his cause by means of purge. Ida raised his hand high above his head. And whatever beliefs you may hold, that and that alone is an error. And in true Ida fashion, he swiped his hand down in an exaggerated chopping motion. And so, in order to ensure that people like that may not hereafter multiply, I shall proceed down the path of being a hero anew. Even after everything, Midori couldn't help the smile that blossomed on his face, delicately soft like the innocence of everything normal. Gami smiled too, not that anyone could tell, ruffling his hand through his successor's hair. You are all good kids. Now, class is almost upon us, so take your seats. The ghost had winced. Loud, but good. Class is upon you. The classroom door had moved to reveal Aizawa standing on the other side. He's right. Get to your seats. Everyone scrambled to their desks. Midori didn't have to move much, throwing himself down in his seat. From beside him, Todoroki gave a pointed look, and without any words, Midori responded with a smile and a nod. His friend smiled back, however small it was, and that was enough to light up Midori's mood just like every time before. They'd made it. The night was long over. First, I'd like to congratulate you on your first internships as heroes in training. I'm sure you all gained valuable insight into the varying types of work heroes are responsible for. There were some mutters, comments around the room. Midoriya swore he heard some under-the-breath complaints, and he almost got a bit jealous. He almost wished he could complain about his internship experience instead of walking away with the overwhelming relief that it didn't go any worse than it had. However, heroics doesn't wait until you're ready, so we'll be moving on. Aizawa interrupted the chatter. You'll find your costumes in the 1A locker rooms. Get dressed and meet us out on Ground Gamma. That was the cue for the class to get up from their seats and collectively move toward the locker rooms. Naturally, Midoriya met up with Ida and Todoroki so they could all walk together, huddled protectively at the back of the group. Sure enough, their costumes were waiting for them inside their personal lockers, and Midoriya wasted no time spinning in his combination. He leaned the briefcase against the floor of the locker and curiously popped open the seals. He was surprised, at the same time not, to find his costume in better shape than the first day he'd received it. The rips and tears in the fabric had been seamlessly mended, even without a scar. The clothing felt completely new, like he hadn't even been thrown around in the dirt and grime of an alleyway 3 nights ago. All his blood that had once stained, even the darkest parts of his suit, had been so thoroughly removed, it was like it had never been there to begin with. All in all, he was extremely impressed, except for the fact that his insufferable hat had rested atop. Need to have a word with Nezu, he grumbled under his breath, taking the wad of clothing under his arm and closing the locker door. Gami followed silently as his successor had naturally walked toward one of the stalls in the back of the locker room. Before suddenly having to stop when the other froze in his tracks, worried, the ghost flew forward, hoping to see what was wrong, but instead of a shocked look on Midoriya's face, he was merely met with one of surprise. Before he could say anything, Midoriya walked away from the stall and instead to one of the benches just beside. To his own surprise, as well as the surprise of his male classmates that noticed, Midoriya set his costume down and began to remove his uniform far from the safety of the closed stall door like he usually did. Midoriya had stopped wearing the dark turtlenecks he used to stuff under his uniform top almost immediately after the sports festival. It had been quite a while since then, but he hadn't really spent those days wearing the uniform, so it didn't feel as long as it was. But he had, and what he thought would have been him constantly scratching at a scar that peeked out from his collar ended up being practically him forgetting about it. Which led to today. Right now, he could have gone into that stall like he always had, but he didn't need to anymore. There were some stairs. Not that he was really surprised by that. He could feel nervousness start to creep up his spine. Not that he really was surprised by that either. What he was surprised about was seeing Kirishima flash a toothy smile with a thumbs up. That definitely caught him off guard, but otherwise he pushed back the worry that was brewing in his gut, as no one else had made a move. This was nothing more than a reminder of his upbringing. His blood was not a thing to be bound by. He didn't see Todoroki's soft smile at him from the other end of the room. He didn't see Bakugo's pained scowl in his direction before promptly leaving the room. Still, he didn't take his time getting dressed. Finishing quickly and making his exit out of the locker room, he held his hat in his hands, opting to wait as long as he could before having to put it on. Maybe it was out of annoyance, maybe it was out of spite. Regardless, talking to Nezu was now in the forefront of his mind. If that rodent could be sadistically insufferable, then so could he. If it was about making a point, nothing more, nothing less. And maybe a little spite after all, not that he would admit it. Izuku! Todoroki's voice had called from behind him. Midoriya spun around, a little confused. Shoto, did you need something? Well, not really. Todoroki jogged forward a bit to catch up with him. I just wanted to walk with you. At that, Midoriya felt himself growing slightly nervous. He would never call it flustered, Gami might, but he would never. Did it matter that Gami was always right? No, not at all. Let's go, then, he beckoned with a wave. They continued down the hall, with Midoriya eventually surrendering the lead to Todoroki upon realizing he had absolutely no idea where Ground Gamma was in relation to the locker rooms. He ignored Gami's stifled laughter from behind him. You seem to be doing better, Todoroki remarked out of the blue as they had traversed the school grounds. Midoriya didn't need any context to understand. I am. I feel more free than I ever thought I could, you know? Yeah, I know. Me too. Todoroki smiled gingerly, placing a hand over his heart. I don't think I'd be here without you, so thank you for not giving up on me. Midoriya nudged him playfully, his look growing more sincere upon gaining his friend's attention. And I've got you, Ida, Uraraka, and everyone else to think that I'm here, too. I'd like to think that we bring out the best in each other. Todoroki huffed lightly as they exited the building into the blinding sun overhead. Maybe so. They sauntered over to the rest of their class, building into a large group in front of a massive concrete wall. An even bigger set of steel doors was the only thing that cut through the wall, along with a smaller sign that had a gamma symbol etched into it. Whoa. Midoriya couldn't stop the gasp that left his lips. Truly impressive. Gami followed. He looked around and, upon realizing that they were still waiting on some of his successor's classmates, had daringly moved forward. I wonder what is beyond that. He caught himself, remembering he was still among all his classmates, instead of swearing under his breath, as he could do nothing to stop the ghost from peeking beyond the walls. He watched Gami poke his head through the concrete, before floating back to him excitedly. It is like a maze through there. Endless layers of metallic structures, pipes everywhere, everything is so compact. I cannot imagine how you could even move around in there. The teen could only nod dumbly, unsure if he should even know that beforehand. But before he could think about what to do with that information, the excited murmurs of his classmates interrupted his thoughts, and All Might, the only reason he could think for all the noise, had made his way to stand in front of the intimidating metal doors. Hi, everyone. Now that you're all here, let's begin. The class quickly had quieted down. Right on the heels of your workplace experience, this time we'll mix in an element of play. All Might had gestured behind him to the sealed grounds. A rescue training race. A race? Midoriya stared up at the steel doors. If what Gami said was true, from behind he could feel the rush of air as Ida shot his hand upward. If it's rescue training, then should it not be carried out at the USJ? He barely shuddered this time. He was starting to move on from what had happened there, but even still a part of him was more than glad they weren't at the USJ right now. All Might waved a finger. No, that is a place for disaster rescue. Now, what I was saying. Ah, yes, a race. The hero had made a grand gesture behind him, returning everyone's attention to the wall. This is Ground Gamma, where densely packed lanes make this construction site feel more like a complex labyrinth, All Might began, almost like reading off a script. We will conduct this training in groups of 4 or 5. One group at a time, you'll all start from this gate, and I'll send a distress signal from somewhere inside. Then you'll compete to see who can reach me first. The groups are already picked for you. Aizawa's voice suddenly arose, startling the entire class as he emerged from inside Ground Gamma, throwing the gates open. Midoriya could finally see the grounds now, and if anything, Gami had under-described it. It was a mess of tangling pipes and poles, structures almost growing atop one another, fighting to scrape at the sky. There was no clear path through it. Gave Midoriya claustrophobia just looking at it from afar. Come look at this list. Get yourselves organized. Group 1, wait at the gate and be ready. Of course, keep the damage to the surrounding buildings at a minimum, All Might had added. Along with the rest of the class, Midoriya walked over to read the list in Aizawa's hands, and just his shitty luck, he saw his name immediately at the top of the list as part of the first group. Ojiro, Ida, Ashido, Sero. Gami read off the list of the rest of the group. Those are some of the most mobile people in the class. Midoriya sighed. Gami was right, as always. Still, he looked down at his own hands, gloved, but not for long. If they'd done this before, he would have stood no chance, but now, with a whole new level of skill under his belt, he started to feel confident, which was strange but not unwelcome. Starting group. Take your positions. Aizawa called out. Midoriya lagged back a bit, making a pointed side-eye look at his mentor. Gami never failed to catch those looks. What do you want me to do? He ducked his head a little lower, making sure his mouth was covered by the neck of his costume. Stay with me, Scout. Don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Gami nodded affirmatively. Let's do this. The teen settled into a running position, resting lightly on all fours, ready to take off at a moment's notice. He pressed on his hat as tightly as he could, stuffed away his gloves, and dug the iron soles of his shoes into the dirt. He could feel the cold air of his mentor behind him, hovering intimidatingly over him, and not that anyone else could see. Not that anyone could see his eager grin from under his collar either. Let's do this. Start. Midoriya watched his classmates all take off into the sky as he instead ran right into the metallic chaos. Right, Gami cried out. You can start moving upwards from here. He wasted no time swiveling in that direction. Noticing the inclined metal structure Gami was referring to, he scampered up, making small holes in the metal with his DT to hoist himself up. Once he reached the top, he was only a couple of feet off the ground, but that was also the starting point that he needed. Without even a breath, he exploded forward, shooting his body into the air. The wind threaded through his hair as he laughed giddily, heart soaring as he soared through the sky, but his blast could only take him so far, and he almost forgot as he started plummeting to the ground. The water tower. Midoriya redirected his fall, remembering Gran Torino's words as he sank his feet atop the water tower. He landed solidly, and without hesitation, he immediately ran up an adjacent slanted pipe and launched himself again. Gami managed to keep up with him, curling around pipes and through buildings to race ahead of him. Stay focused. There's a flat roof you can land upon coming up. He nodded, shaking himself out of the suffocating bliss that was blasting through the air to lock eyes with the landing spot that Gami had pointed out. He dropped quickly out of the sky, sank into the concrete of the rooftop, and exploded forward again, flying straight past Zero. The hell? Midoriya couldn't help his laughter. I think Zero was in the lead. All Might shouldn't be much farther ahead. The excitement in Gami's voice quickly pittered out as he looked around frantically. But I do not see a good place to land. The teen, however, noticed an awkwardly placed wall in his line of sight, and while he couldn't land on top, the side was open, blank, and inviting. Time to take a page out of Gran Torino's book. In a sharply angled twist, Midoriya moved to fall right beside the wall, his shoes brushing up against it, and for a split second he pressed his soles against it and pushed off, another dual blast exploding from his fingertips. He was able to fly upwards once again, but the strange angle of his launch had left him with less control of his movement than he liked, so in another split-second decision, Midoriya had summoned his scythe, flooded it with DT, slammed the blade into one of the structures in front of him. The blade sank into the concrete like butter, quickly decelerating his momentum, but with Midoriya still hanging on, the momentum instead snapped him straight up. For just a moment, he gasped at the wonder of his great height, being able to see large chunks of the ground, and upon spotting All Might, his brain kicked into overdrive, another set of blasts bursting from his fingertips to push him forward. That was amazing! Gami had cheered from beside him, making the teen smile, with his eyes focused on a large water tower in the distance, with All Might standing on top, victory just within his grasp. The wind took one last thing from him, his landing. Shit! Midoriya couldn't even really finish his curse, as his foot had slid off a wet pipe, sending him plummeting toward the scaffolding below. Instinctively, his hand had reached up to grab the same pipe, hoping to get a solid grip and prevent his fall. I got you. Instead, his hand grabbed something bony and cold that seamlessly had swung him upward. Without missing a beat, Midoriya followed suit with one last blast, sending him right into the scaffolding on the other side of the water tower, and he collided violently, but his hand still managed to grab onto it successfully, and he allowed himself to actually scale up the rest of the way to the top with relative ease. Young Midoriya! All Might locked eyes with him as he finally pulled himself over the edge of the water tower and onto solid ground. You were the first one here. Congratulations. That was enough to rejuvenate the boy, sending him springing to his feet. Yes! All Might walked forward to meet him. That was some impressive movement. You've surely improved since the sports festival. Then in a lower voice, I'm glad to see that your time with Gran Torino served you well. Midoriya nodded. Thank you. The rest of his group promptly arrived at the top of the water tower, one after another, all panting and completely out of breath. Zero, who arrived first, immediately rushed him. Dude, that was sick! He exclaimed. I'm almost jealous. Ashido, who was just behind him, had stomped her foot exaggeratedly. Ah, you were so cool! Even Ida, as exhausted as he was, reached over to pat him on the back. Very impressive, Midori. He ducked down into his elongated collar, trying to hide the red growing on his cheeks. This time, he was most certainly flustered, bashful nervousness in his eyes. Thanks, guys. Upon Oshiro's arrival, All Might began his spiel. Young Midori was first. However, it's clear that all of you have learned how to use your quirks more broadly since you entered UA. The hero had pumped his fist into the air. Now, keep at it, and begin preparing for the end-of-term test. End-of-term test? God, had it been that long already? His time at UA had felt like a blur. All Might began to lead the group down the tower and out of the grounds, but Midoriya opted to lag behind, searching around for Gami. The ghost hadn't appeared since effortlessly saving his fall just before, and at this point, he was starting to get a little worried. You did it. I knew you could. It took everything Midoriya had not to yelp out in surprise, so he couldn't help jumping a few inches off the ground instead. Goodness, where have you been? The ghost rolled his eyes, not that anyone could tell. Oh, I'm sorry. You're not exactly as light as you were when you were younger. The sarcasm ebbed out of his voice, until it was gone completely. It took all of my energy just to swing you back up. After that, I dropped straight through the ground. It took me a while just to find my way back up. Midoriya immediately softened. Shit, are you all right? I'm fine, but I would prefer not to repeat that experience if necessary. Yeah, I gotcha. Even with a somber look in his eye, he cracked a smile. So I guess that means that my hero dreams of flying in your arms are not happening? Gami shook his head with exasperation. You would just have to settle for me tackling you out of the way dramatically. Bummer, he laughed. Please, not like you. Wait, isn't that your hat? Midori spun around in confusion. What? But sure enough, he followed Gami's outstretched finger to find his hat laying dejectedly between some metal pipes. A hand reached up to touch at his hair, only finding his tousled hair between his fingers. It must have blown off during the race, but for him to not even notice. For no one to notice. Grumbling, he trotted over to pull it from its nook in annoyance. Midori! Ida called out, noticing the other trilling behind. Coming! Hat in hands, he raced over to Ida's side and walked back out of the large metal doors with him. Uraraka immediately bombarded them. You guys were awesome! Congrats on winning, Midori! You've gotten crazy good since the sports festival, and you too, Ida. Man, I wish I could move like you guys. Midori laughed at her hyperactivity. Just wait until you get the chance to show off your moves from Gunhead. Aren't you up next? Ida interjected, like the responsible class president he was. Oh, shoot, yeah. She jumped on her feet, jogging toward the gate they just walked through. We'll talk after. Midoriya waved her goodbye and good luck, unknowingly missing how Bakugo scouted him from behind him, slowly sinking further away. He did notice how Ida slowly drifted off into the rest of the crowd and how Todoroki prepared to race next with Uraraka's group, leaving him standing awkwardly alone. Well, he wasn't technically alone, besides being with Gami, but it wasn't like they could talk right now with everyone around. Problem child. The teen jumped for a second time, still keeping the yelp down in his throat. He turned to see Aizawa standing behind him, not really to his surprise. What was surprising was finding him here, and not by the gate like he was when Midoriya had started his race. Aizawa didn't wait for a response. Can you meet me in Nezu's office after class? Something he wants to talk about, apparently. Midoriya swallowed nervously, as he always did when Nezu was mentioned. Like after this? End of the day, the teacher clarified before softening his expression. Don't worry about it too much. I'm sure it's nothing too major. Somehow Midoriya doubted that, but he only nodded silently as Aizawa walked away to start the next group's race. Well, at least you'll get the chance to talk to him about that hat. Somehow Midoriya doubted that too. Once the rescue race had wrapped up, the class made their way back to the locker rooms, where again the boys and girls split to their respective spaces. Midoriya quickly changed. Not that he was second-guessing his decision to be out in the open, but the thought of lunch just around the corner had him much more motivated than usual. Plus, he wanted nothing to do with whatever Mineta was babbling off about to the side. He was a little surprised that he wasn't the first one to his table, considering how fast he left the locker room, but he wasn't really paying attention, so it really didn't surprise him that both Ida and Todoroki were already waiting for him. They were still waiting on Uraraka and Asui, though, so Midoriya couldn't dig into the tempting food in front of him, as much as his stomach had begged. I never got to say, but you were really impressive out there, Todoroki remarked, playing with his set of chopsticks. You really improved with Gran Torino. I didn't realize how much. It was hard to tell that night. That night was hard for a lot of reasons. Still, Midoriya chuckled lightly. Guess that means I win. Todoroki looked confused. What? You know, Midoriya gestured obviously. Our challenge? The gears clicked in his head. I don't know. Were you even paying attention to me out there? Oh, he was. Way too much attention. That was the problem. Sure, you aren't the same Shoto as before, but come on, I can practically fly now. Careful, you are getting into exaggeration territory now. Gami had laughed from behind him. But that didn't matter, because now they were all laughing, and that was all Midoriya could ever ask for. What's got you three all giggly? Uraraka interrupted from behind, Asui right on her tail. Midoriya waved her off as the two girls sat down. What took you guys so long? He countered. He didn't expect the girls to visibly shiver. Mineta. The usual. Jiro got him good, though, Asui added. Earphone jack right in the eye. He winced in phantom pain, reaching up to his own eye instinctively. Never mind all that. Uraraka reached over to her own set of chopsticks. Let's eat. Midoriya's stomach rumbled. That he could agree on. The group eagerly dug into their lunch, trying to satiate the appetite they'd all worked up from the rescue exercise earlier. As Midoriya shoved rice into his mouth, he could only hope that what he had in front of him would be enough. He stopped momentarily, only to take a sip of water, when he felt Gami nudge him lightly on the head. Slow down, you're going to choke. The food will still be there. Midoriya sighed. Gami was right, and he knew. No one was going to take his lunch away from him, and he still was going to get dinner, and lunch again the next day. Sometimes, though, it was just easy to forget that. Carefully he picked his utensils back up again, only to get whacked even harder in the back of the head. This time, he was unable to stop the pained yelp from exploding out of his mouth, scattering his chopsticks across the table. Izuku! Todoroki hissed, instinctively reaching over to check his head. Are you all right? Midoriya didn't have a chance to respond, rubbing his head as he turned around to see Monoma, the Class 1B kid. Ah, my bad. He started with an expression that definitely did not convey sympathy. Your head's so big, I ended up whacking you upside it. Fucking ratbag. Gami growled out, barely restraining himself from clawing the boy's eyes out. Todoroki nearly growled himself, pressing himself closer to Midoriya's side as the rest of the table grew antsy. What's your problem? If Monoma was deterred, he clearly didn't show it. You lot encountered the hero killer, I heard. And just like that, Something heavy sank to the bottom of Midoriya's stomach. Uraraka and Asawi could only watch as Ida now moved in protectively, narrowing his eyes from behind his glasses. You just love basking in the spotlight, don't you? You weren't satisfied with your sports festival high, so you had to go seeking out the hero killer for some more attention? Is that it? Monoma sneered. Midori couldn't stop the flinch. That ran down his nerves. There was something in his mouth. He hadn't started eating again, had he? What was he eating? He raised a shaky hand to his lips. Why did it taste metallic? One day you're going to get yourselves wrapped up in something you can't handle. And what then? He could taste it now. There was blood in his mouth. Why was there blood in his mouth? He could taste the chunks of rotten flesh. It burned its way down his throat. It was disgusting. Sickening. Downright nauseating. So why was that smile still echoing in the back of his mind? Class 1A falls from grace, the tragedy, but Class 1B will be there to... Monoma's rant was cut short, as a hand wedged hard into his neck, causing him to collapse into another student's arms. That's not funny, she reprimanded him. Those three went through a lot. Midori couldn't breathe. Why couldn't he breathe? Todoroki had finally noticed, and moved his hand from the back of Midori's head to slap him on the back. The impact caused Midori to sputter, coughing violently into his hands, expelling nothing but spit droplets onto his gloves, not blood. But he could breathe again, and his throat was clear. Are you all right? Todoroki looked at him softly. Any trace of the venom directed at Monoma was completely gone. Yeah, sorry, Midori choked out, both spit and embarrassment. The girl, still with Monoma in her arms, also softened upon seeing Midori's reaction. Sorry about him. He's a whole lot of work, but Class 1B means well, and we're glad to see that you three are all right after encountering the hero killer. Ida nodded for them all. Thank you. Kendo, why are you still making amends with those detested... She, Kendo, had hit him again. I told you, we don't detest them. And then promptly it dragged him away from the group before he could do any more damage. It wasn't until the two were far out of sight that the group finally clicked back to reality. Still, nobody dared to make a move and break the tension until Midoriya awkwardly reached for his scattered chopsticks, reminding everyone just how he'd reacted. Midori, are you all right? Ida sent him a worried stare, and Midori didn't know whether to feel uncomfortable at the thought of having to lie to him, or relieved that the look was one of worry and not hate. Yeah, I'm good. We don't mean just right now, with whatever just happened with Class 1B. Todoroki interrupted, with the suspicion of someone who cared. Because whatever made you react like that, it wasn't just them. He shuffled nervously, swallowing back the metallic taste. Starting to resurface, it didn't really help. Asawi reached a hand out, with a fragility in her eyes he truly hadn't seen since the USJ. You don't have to tell us what it is, but you can be honest with us. We're your friends, Midori. You don't need to lie to us to spare our feelings. And Midori was suddenly taken aback, to the morning that he spent in the hospital room in Hosu, staring across at Todoroki as he told him the same exact thing. He was taken back to the same look in Todoroki's eyes, one that begged for truth and the vulnerability of their friendship. He was taken back to the same feeling of safety and absolute trust he held, and wondered how long he'd truly been in the present instead of the past. So he nodded, and set his utensils down, leaving his rice to get cold. I've been having nightmares. It wasn't a complete lie. Most of his hero-killer premonitions had come as nightmares, after all. Oh, Midori! Uraraka reached over the table to touch his hand, and he did not move away even on instinct. But I'm really fine, trust me. He tried to settle the atmosphere before Ida could feel bad or Todoroki could challenge him. Most of them are about what could have been or could have happened, and sitting here with all of you, I have proof that it didn't. He relished, selfishly, in all the warm looks that they gave him instead of the cold buzz of what could have been Ida's soul in his hands. And the rest, well, I know he's locked away where he can't hurt anyone else. Ida leaned to wrap an arm around Midoriya's back in a comfortingly tight gesture. No, he can't. He has no more power over us. He truly didn't, as he lost the shackles of any more premonitions by his hand. We made it. Todoroki nodded firmly in resolve. That night is over. It was. It really was. They didn't talk much more after that, agreeing to try and use what was left of their lunch period actually eating, and it didn't really matter that the food got cold or that they didn't get to finish all of it because Midori's stomach got full on something a bit more satisfying. They walked together back to the classroom, joined like the inseparable links of a sturdy chain, because even if only 3 of them had gone through hell that night, the aftermath had bled out by extension. They were in this together, the good, the bad, and everything in between. Gami just trailed behind, not wanting to intrude on the group, and yet close enough that the drop in temperature was still there. He was glad his successor had Such a strong group of friends to stick with him, but yet he wondered if it was wrong to wish the same for himself. Did he ever have anyone like that when he was... Filled with the sickening feeling that he was even more alone back then than he could ever feel right now, he stopped thinking. They'd all just sat down in their seats as Aizawa had walked in, hushing the room to a standstill as he approached the front of the classroom. "Let's see," he mumbled while flipping through a stack of papers. "Summer break is approaching fast, but of course it stands to reason that none of you have enough leeway to just relax on your own." Excited whispers flooded the air as his peers had shared eager glances amongst themselves, but Midoriya and Todoroki shared their own look of suspicion, comfortable in the heavy layer of paranoia they'd built up as a defense for everything wrong with the world. "We'll be going to a summer break force lodge." At that, the class erupted into cheers. How exciting! Gami attempted to wash away the nervousness radiating off of his successor. Come on, you have to give it at least a chance. Gami was right, like he always was, but this time it did little to ease the sloshing of Midoriya's stomach. Still, he swallowed the anxiety he knew remained from encountering the hero killer and attributed his current bad feeling to nothing but unease that had overstayed its welcome. However, the firmness in Aizawa's tone reined everyone back in, as his normally slouched eyes had widened, and the scar on his cheek seemed to flare. "Should any of you fall short of a passing grade for the end-of-term test, then you'll be stuck in remedial school." Midoriya shuddered unconsciously. Talk about harsh. "That," Aizawa collected the stack of papers he'd been casually looking through, "is all I have for today. I'm letting you out early." That is quite unlike him. He pondered aloud. I wonder if it has anything to do with his meeting with Nezu. And Midoriya had shrugged half-heartedly to his mentor, watching as the class again had bursted into excitement, up and congregating with each other. He kept to himself as he packed up his things, tuning in and out the different pockets of conversation all around the room. Ida, Uraraka, and Hosu were talking about getting their midterm grades back, likely a bit anxious about how they potentially had scored with the final exam getting close. Kaminari and Ashido were blabbering about something to do with potentially having to show off their quirks for the exam, something like the quirk apprehension test. It made sense considering how volatile their quirks still were. Yaoyorozu seemed to have a crowd of people around her, all nervously asking her things. It was a bit jumbled. Couldn't really make it out, but it turned out that he didn't have to, as she then made her way to the front of the room. "Can I have your attention, everyone?" The class had died down their chatter. "As class vice president, I believe it would be extremely beneficial to organize class study sessions in preparation for the final." Ida shot out of his chair stiffly. "I concur, but where would we host these sessions so that they'd be accessible to everyone?" "They can be at my house," she exclaimed with a sparkle in her eye, much like a small child. "I can provide transportation to anyone who needs it." Gami felt something in his chest at seeing such an innocent expression of heartfelt joy, framed by locks of dark black hair, something rather painful as he immediately looked away and shrunk into the shadows. Yaoyorozu's reaction died down, replaced by now a look of concern. "How would we arrange them, though?" Midori stood up naturally, holding his phone. "I think I have pretty much everyone's number. I don't mind working with you to help organize everything, since you're already offering to host." "Of course, prepared as always, Secretary Midoriya." Ida had cheered as Midori made his way to join Yaoyorozu up front. "All right. Anyone who hasn't given Midori their number yet, please step forward to do so," she called out, and a few stragglers came up. Midori pretty much had the entire class in his contact since the USJ incident, but if he was missing anybody before, he certainly wasn't now. She turned to him as he finished typing in the last number. "Is that everyone?" Midori responded to her with a nervous look. "Well..." His eyes shifted to the door, where the angry hothead of the class had stood, ready to open it and leave. Yaoyorozu was deductive enough not to need an answer. "Bakugo, wait." But that was all it took for a heavy air to fill the room. Bakugo turned around, a typically furious expression painted across his face, but Midori instantly noticed the blankness in his eyes, took a natural step back as his heart plummeted to his feet. And as he watched that blankness visibly turn to deep hatred, he knew something was seriously wrong. "I don't want to do anything with any of you idiots. Unlike you, I don't need anyone's help to succeed, and I certainly don't want it." Midoriya was perfectly fine leaving it at that, and judging by Yaoyorozu's silence, so was she. "Who are you calling an idiot, idiot?" Kaminari, however, wasn't. "Shut up," he snapped. "So fucking tired of you idiots trying to interject where you aren't wanted." He then turned. "Especially you, Deku." The name didn't make him flinch, but the sheer hatred in his eyes certainly did. It was then that Gami had joined him at his side, and if looks could kill, Bakugo's life would have turned into a cold case. Bakugo stepped closer in this quiet, cold fury, so unlike his natural hot-headed self, it took every ounce of resolve in Midoriya's blood not to step back and run like his body screamed at him to. You were never supposed to be here. The words escaped him in a slow release, pointedly driving them into Midoriya's skull. You weren't supposed to get a quirk, and even though you did, you should know that what you have was never meant to save anyone. Midori couldn't stop the flinch as those words pierced his heart, and every insecurity he thought he was finally moving away from like an arrow to a bullseye. It was so hurtful, it was so hateful, and yet it sounded nothing like Bakugo at all. Recovering from the emotional wound, he missed how Bakugo clutched at his head, fingers digging into his scalp. Get out of my head! He seethed, gritting his teeth like he was in pain. I want nothing to do with you or your shitty quirk. I can't even bear to look at you. It's really trying my goddamn nerves, shitrag. Gami growled as other people started to worm their way between the two, trying to de-escalate the growing situation, but Bakugo wasn't done, not by a long shot. Let me tell you, you fill me with nothing but hate, a pathetic excuse for a human being. Bakugo then gripped his head again, and this time, Midoriya didn't miss the wince. This is all your fault. You and your fucking quirk. I want nothing to do with you, so stop fucking with me. Midoriya froze, unable to hear any of the defenses for him by his peers. His mind locked onto the last bout of venom Bakugo had spit. The hate. The curse. Bakugo knew. Then Bakugo's hand lowered from his head, and as his eyes had steeled over with the hate Midoriya recognized all too well. I'll annihilate you, he muttered under his breath like he wasn't aware that he had said it. I'm going to fucking murder you. The fire returned to his eyes, replacing that lifeless, cold hatred that had taken over, and Bakugo stormed out of the classroom, throwing the door shut behind him. Immediately, his friends rushed to his side, Todoroki's arm at his back, Uraraka draped at his side, Ida's stature shielding them all from immediate view. Midori, Uraraka began softly, for both his potential fragility and his privacy. Are you all right? All he could do was nod, swallowing painfully down his dry throat. Yeah, I'm okay, just a bit uneasy. No one said anything else, but as Midori locked eyes with Todoroki, he could see the gears turning in his head. Damn it. Damn it all to hell. Man, Kirishima sighed. That's some vintage Bakugo. How long's it been? Maybe he's irritated, Tokiyami offered. Or just sheer animosity. No, it was none of that. Midoriya knew it was none of that. In fact, he was appalled that he hadn't realized it before. He thought that it had been a one-time thing, Bakugo filled with enough hatred to nearly cost himself his career as he tried to kill him after the battle training exercise, but he was wrong. How had he been so wrong? He could only assume that if he hadn't broken Todoroki or Ida out of their hate, that they would have continued to hate him for the rest of their lives until he did. He assumed that the hatred in Bakugo just dissipated after the battle training incident, but he never actually broke him out of it because he didn't know he had to. He assumed that the battle training incident was the first time Bakugo ever experienced a hatred like that because he never truly realized people could act toward him in kindness. How long had Bakugo been afflicted by his curse? And how long had Bakugo had an inkling that he was aware of his unnatural hate? God, he was going to be sick. Izuku. Midori jumped into his skin. Now aware that Todoroki had been calling his name, he knew why, but he couldn't afford to think about it right now. I'm sorry, I need to go. He ripped himself out of his friend's arms, scrambling for his backpack sitting at his desk. Wait, Todoroki called out for him. Please. No, but he refused, throwing the door open himself. I need to leave. The entire class had watched as he ran out of the classroom, not even bothering to close the door behind him, as he disappeared down the hall. It was a lucky thing that the school day was coming to an end, because Midoriya was sure that no one would be pleased to take a trip to the bathroom and instead find him retching into the last stall. He wasn't sure where he needed to go once he had stumbled out of the classroom, so he just let his legs take him to the most private place he could think of while still on school grounds, and once he instinctively had entered the bathroom, the churning in his gut hit him full force. He was reduced to his knees, reduced to a sickly, pitiful mess as his face had excreted all of its bodily fluids down into the toilet bowl beneath him. Midori would have been overwhelmed by the disgusting new low that he just hit if he hadn't been overwhelmed by the implications of his realization first. For once, he was glad not to hear Gami's voice as he emptied the contents of his stomach. He could feel a pocket of cold air on his back, but he managed to convince himself that it was simply a draft. No one was here to witness this. His body crumpled as his coughing had slowed down, having nothing left to give and nothing left to lose. He leaned back in exhaustion, his spine cracking from its slouched position before. His lungs ached as he took slow, deep breaths to compensate for the hell that he just put them through, and it wasn't until he had stopped consciously thinking about his breathing that he realized he'd been copying Gami's the whole time. His mentor was quick to scoop him into his arms. Can you stand? Midori tightened his grip onto his worn robes. Yeah. Neither made mention as the teen had sank further into the ghost's arms, using him as an anchor to pull himself to his feet. Midoriya raised the sleeve of his uniform to wipe away the evidence on his face, but Kami had gently swatted his arm away. His mentor then pulled at the end of his own sleeve until it covered his bony hand, and wiped away any trace of his previous weakness. You cannot keep doing this alone. He lowered his sleeve, able to clear all but the redness around his eyes. This is getting to be too big, bigger than we are able to handle. Midoriya swallowed, his throat burning up from the previous abuse. What are we supposed to do? He couldn't see Kami's eyes, but he could feel the seriousness that echoed from them. We need to bring the heroes into this. Kami was always right, but this time Midoriya couldn't bear to admit that was true. Shifting Midoriya onto one arm, Kami used the other to pluck his school bag from the floor with ease. The meeting. Eraserhead is going to be there. We need to speak with him. He took the bag out of his mentor's hands. At the meeting? But Nezu's going to be there too. What if there are other teachers? If everyone there knows, then we cannot afford to wait a second more. As for as much as that rodent stirs up unnecessary trouble, I hate to admit that him knowing may actually be useful. The gloves and some of the additions to your costume have been helpful, but you otherwise would not have obtained them without his interference. Nodding, he stepped out of the stall, swinging his backpack on. It was impossible to miss his reflection in the mirror above the sink, and he instinctively cringed at how obvious his face was red. So he splashed some water onto his cheeks, and he did his best to rub it all away before drying himself off with his sleeve. It would be pointless to admit that Kami was right yet again, so instead he simply took hold of Kami's sleeve like he always did when he was nervous, and exited the bathroom. The school day had ended while he was hiding out, but the halls were emptier than he expected. Still, Midoriya made careful effort to stick to the shadows, slinking up the staircase and down the hall once more until he finally neared the door to Nezu's office. Aizawa stood there patiently, leaning against the wall just beside, but as Midoriya approached, he straightened out his stance. I figured I'd wait for you so we could go in together, make it harder for Nezu to bombard you with whatever he wants to talk about. He stopped talking as the teen grew closer, frowning slightly at the shaky smile Midoriya was pushing forward. Aizawa narrowed his eyes, but did not speak on it. Slowly he turned the doorknob. Come on, let's get this over with so we can go home. Nezu sat in wait at his oversized desk, his smile widening unnervingly as he watched them enter. He perked up, pushing himself up in his chair and then climbing atop his desk. Once he reached the end, he plopped back down and let his legs dangle over the edge. Aizawa closed the door behind them as Midoriya walked over to the small couch that sat before the desk. He sat down in false confidence as Aizawa eventually joined him laxly on the other side. He would have laughed at the irony of the situation just a couple months before they were all in this exact position as Midoriya was cornered in spilling his biggest secret. Now here he was about to tell them another, this time of his own volition. Funny how that changed. Unfortunately, he wasn't really in a laughing mood. So glad you could both make it, Nezu chirped, his tail flicking aimlessly. Would either of you care for some tea? Just get to the point. Midoriya would have flinched at the harshness if it weren't for the fact that he agreed. Nezu's smile didn't drop. Very well. The principal then reached behind, pulling out a single sheet of what appeared to be cheap writing paper, creased with the scars of recent folds. The writer of this letter went through a lot of trouble just to get it to me, he trailed off. So imagine my surprise when I saw the recipient of this letter was really meant to be you, Midoriya. He blinked in surprise. A letter for him, one that had to go through Nezu. This is why they were here? He couldn't help the slight shaking of his hands as he carefully took the paper from Nezu's paws, allowing Aizawa to read from the side as his eyes delicately passed over every handwritten word. To the hero called Owari. When I began my pursuit of a cleaner hero society, my only worry had always been if there would ever be enough true heroes to fill the gap, pried by those inferior. For as set as I had been in my path, my intention was never to create more responsibility for the heroes that did earn my respect. It was simply the consequences of a greater good. A consequence I knew for certain the heroes that were chosen to achieve great change could handle. Never had another worry ever occupied my thoughts. I didn't expect one to. None of those who fell by my hand spoke enough truth untainted by the desperation of their own survival. By that very logic, I should have expected that truth to present itself in a true hero instead. But I still was unprepared to hear something I couldn't ignore, and naive to think I would never hear at all. Never have I felt so unsure over the course of my path. Your truth held merit. Enough that my own selfishness wishes to have never heard it at all. And if I were of weaker resolve, I would succumb. It's truly a shame how the world so easily settles to move through time with no resolve at all, that people like Shigaraki with simple-minded spontaneity can hold an undeserved influence just because society refuses the effort, with anything other than indecisiveness. And yet, under the puppeteering of callous ideals and monstrous power, the world is in great danger of mindless violence and hate. Shigaraki is nothing more than a child, unable to define reasoning in his spoiled impulsiveness, but his fixation with you as his newest toy has severe implications toward the future you will bring. You are the harbinger of great change, and while I am glad to have defended you in my servitude, I cannot do so again. No quirk is inherently good or evil. It's merely a tool to be used to serve peace, and to bring great change means using every part of it. Even at sacrificing the public's flawed perception, I know you understand. Having a quirk like yours, a quirk like mine, there is no room for fear among the unavoidable fear of society. To hold on to fear means to hold back a part of you, to hold back the change festering inside of you. And there may come a time where you have to choose between fear and the world, and even a true hero may fall because they have chosen fear long enough that they could no longer go back. I write this to you, if only to offer a path beyond fear, to teach you the art of the blade so that you may gain the choice to use it. I need nothing in return. It would be my honor to cultivate even a part of a true hero into existence. Regardless, I wait patiently to hear of you again. Either by your own volition, or simply by the change you will infect with the world as it trickles through the walls considered to be impenetrable. With gratitude, Agakuro Chizome. Midoriya didn't realize he'd been unconsciously mouthing the words as he read them until he reached the end, and his mouth remained parted as if it expected more. He didn't even need to look at Aizawa to know what he was feeling. No, absolutely not. Nezu didn't sound deterred. You speak as if you have any say in the matter, and not as if you were made aware only by courtesy. Midoriya couldn't stop his eyes from instinctually shifting to his teacher after that, knowing very well what he'd see. Of course, even as restrained as he was, nothing could stop the genuine anger that seeped forth through Aizawa's eyes. I'm his guardian. Midoriya is a ward of the school, Nezu countered before he could finish. You are merely an extension. The two faced down in a heated silence that left the teen squirming for distance. His heart thumped with so much fear, and not just from the letter did his opinion not matter. Did Nezu see this as another one of his experiments? What was the point of having them here at all, if nothing mattered? Aizawa seethed, but backed down, knowing that he had been bested. So what was the point of this, then, Nezu, if only you have a say in this decision? Well, for one, I figured you'd both want to read the letter yourselves. His voice still remained upbeat, as if the tension in the room was merely a figment of their imaginations. Plus, I did want to assure that I will take every precaution to make these interactions as safe as possible. Of course, you'll be there, Aizawa, and the hero killer will have no access to sharp weapons during the sessions. Midoriya's weapon will be there as the only one in the room, and he can remove it at will. Interactions. Sessions? The pro-hero looked one word away from having an aneurysm. Just where are you planning to host these, in Tartarus? If Nezu noted the sarcasm, he didn't make mention of it. Why, yes, actually. It would be the safest place for all parties, and I've already reserved a space designated in the prison for just this. He continued as if his words left no impact at all. Of course, this is all for the benefit of Midoriya. UA doesn't have a specialist in combat weapons primarily because those are often discouraged in hero work, and while we do accept hero students whose quirks mimic weapons such as Kamakiri, Togaru, and 1B with quirk razor sharp, never have we accepted a hero student whose quirk is so blindly linked to a weaponry. This is quite unprecedented land that we tread on. Midoriya swallowed dryly, unsure if he could even form words, if he was ever asked for his voice. Cut the crap, Nezu. Why do you really want this to happen? The rodent leaned back onto his paws, making the effort to show just how relaxed he was. I already told you, this is for the benefit of Midoriya. Aizawa did not break his piercing stare into Nezu's beady eyes, even after he finished his answer, and after what seemed like an eternity of a thick stalemate, Nezu's smile curled up just a hair more. Of course, I would be lying if I told you I wasn't curious about the development itself. And there it was. Kami had to bite back the growl that threatened to erupt from his soul. Just how much of Midoriya's circumstances did Nezu see as an experiment, as a game? Though I must ask, how are you feeling about all this, Midoriya? How do you feel about this arrangement? As for these two, they've let their imperfections drive them, and for that they don't deserve the title of a hero. The teen's breath hitched unconsciously, and yet, by some miracle, he managed to push back his building fear to look Nezu right in the eyes. Does it really matter how I feel? It sounds like you're going through with this regardless. The principal's smile exploded into a toothy grin. Maybe. Maybe not. Who knows? It was disgusting, to the point where Midoriya knew it wasn't the work of his curse, but rather the already warped mind of the psychotic animal in front of him. He hated this. He didn't want to do this. He could have gone the rest of his mortal life having never heard the hero killer's name again, and that still wouldn't have been enough. And yet, Something spiteful in his chest had bloomed. He wasn't going to let Nezu hear him admit his obvious disagreement. He wasn't going to let Nezu hear him admit just how much power he held over him, even if it was obvious. Fuck that. Fine. He did not elaborate. Gami moved to cry out in shock, but the sound got caught in his throat as his non-existent heart had stuttered. He could feel the petty defiance rolling off his successor in waves, and yet he could feel the desperation to hold himself together much more. Something in his soul resonated, at that, something he recognized but could not place. What had happened to him? Nezu clapped. Wonderful. I've already gotten everything set up, of course, so it's just a matter of arranging the first session. I'll let you both know when I have a date. Aizawa, still very clearly ticked off, stood up promptly from his seat. Well, if that's all, we'll be going home now. And as for uncomfortable as everything had already gotten, for as much as Midoriya wanted to just leave to the safety of Aizawa and Yamada and maybe some hot chocolate, you weren't supposed to get a quirk, and even though you did, you should know that what you have was never meant to save anyone. He couldn't. I want nothing to do with you, so stop fucking with me. He couldn't. There's something I need to tell you, he stuttered out, just as both Aizawa and Nezu prepared to move on. About my quirk. They stopped moving, and the smirk on Nezu's face finally dropped, but just ever so slightly. Aizawa, can you lock the door? The underground hero silently did just that. Before returning to his spot on the couch next to Midoriya, the teen hesitantly looked up to him, and when he found a compassionately soft look staring back at him instead of the fury from just before, he felt some of his anxiety melt away. His head snapped to the side when he felt the other side of the couch sink, finding Gami lowering himself gently onto the cushions. Once he was sure he wasn't going to pass right through, the ghost relaxed a bit, snaking an arm around Midoriya's shoulders to pull him closer. I'm right here. The teen smiled, breathing in deeply to try and soothe his churning in his gut. Aizawa nodded, not knowing what was said, but agreeing nonetheless. What is it, Midoriya? I wasn't sure at first. That's why I didn't say anything before. All Gami and I had were theories. He realized he was starting to ramble and inhaled again to slow down. I think my powers are cursing people. No. He could not stop the instinctual way that it came out, but Midoriya immediately had turned to look at his mentor in confusion. What do you mean, no? You were the one who proposed the idea in the first place. My apologies, that is not what I meant. He backtracked. You said it was because of your powers, and I don't know, it just sounded wrong. Midoriya. He snapped back to Nezu. Sorry, Gami was getting finicky about the wording. He doesn't think it's linked to my abilities as... He cut himself off. Wait, Gami, did something like this happen to you? Gami moved to disagree when something echoed in his very soul in the center of his being. I was blessed by the gods of ancient texts whose names were lost to legend, something. But he told me to not be afraid, that I was being chosen to carry out the gods' will just as he had a century ago. No, someone. Someone has finally seen worth in me, gods no less. Someone in the depth of his soul had screamed of betrayal. I don't know. Midoriya, I don't mean to interrupt, Nezu started again. But this curse you were talking about? The teen nodded frantically, realizing he'd gotten off track again. I really don't know what triggers it, but sometimes the people I care about just start to hate me for no reason. And I know it sounds crazy and paranoid, but hear me out. Aizawa placed a hand gently on Midoriya's leg. No one is doubting you. If we can believe in Gami, then I think we can easily believe this too. He took in another breath. Ida was acting really off since just before we left for internships, like he couldn't stand to even look at me. When I got his premonition, I was so scared, so I called him right after just to ask him not to do anything reckless. I don't care if you're worried. I don't care what you're feeling, and I certainly don't care to listen to you. He said some really awful things, stuff I know Ida would never say. Nezu hummed in thought. Ida was under quite the amount of stress at the time due to his brother. I know. This time Midoriya interjected. That's what I thought it was too, but it was only directed at me, never at Todoroki or Uraraka or anyone else. He only made an effort to remind me how much he hated me, and all of a sudden, in the middle of the fight against the hero killer, I managed to get through to him, and it was a complete turnaround. It was like his hatred for me had lifted. Tell them about the others. Todoroki and I have been really close, and then suddenly during the sports festival he changed completely. It was like we'd never been friends at all. I'm not pretending to be anyone's friend. It was him that tipped Gami off that it was something deeper. Todoroki and I had talked in between the events, and he sounded so wrong. He didn't understand why he hated me so much, but he kept saying how much he wanted to hurt me, and... Midoriya choked on a sob, and Gami's hand was immediately at his back, rubbing small circles. And I watched him tear himself apart. He knew something was wrong, and he was right. Shit. Aizawa pressed his nails into his palm. Midoriya. The uncontrollable urge of violence. Kami reminded, the curse. It warps people close to you to turn them against you, whether that be physically or emotionally. Its one goal is to see you suffer. Midoriya had composed himself. Kami had a theory about it. He thinks that the curse targets the people that I care about, to keep me alone, so that I keep suffering. It infects people with unnatural hate so that they act irrationally, to ruin their relationship with me. Ida wanted me to leave him in the alley so the hero killer could... He stumbled. And Todoroki tried to kill me during our tournament match. And the Kyoris. When I got to talk with Kiori Ryoyami, he told me that his brother had been acting strangely the day that he killed Ishihara. He was so adamant that Ryodai would never have escalated like that, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized he might have been cursed too. But since it was so different compared to Todoroki and Ida's affliction, Gami and I wondered if it was just a coincidence. It was no coincidence. Midoriya, his teacher called out softly. Why didn't you say anything? He wiped harshly at his eyes. I didn't want to believe it, that it could be my fault that the people I care about are being affected, but I didn't know what to do. The way they all acted, it wasn't their fault. They didn't have any control over my curse warping their minds. I just tried to handle it on my own because I didn't want them to get in trouble for something that they couldn't control. Nezu then perked up curiously. Is that why you stood up for Bakugo after the battle training incident? Midoriya flinched, as that memory was dragged from the depths of where it slept, and as Aizawa turned to him in surprise, he could not mask it in time. Was that why Nezu was so adamant on not having him expelled? You defended him. I'm sorry, Aizawa-sensei. Midoriya couldn't help but feeling like he was disappointing everyone right now. I had no idea about any of the cursed stuff back then, but I knew what Bakugo did during that exercise was off. It bugged me so much because I knew it was something that Bakugo would never do. He would never risk his career for just a pot shot at me. But I didn't have any kind of evidence then, just some gut feeling, until Todoroki started to act similar. He paused to collect his thoughts. I don't know why. Maybe it was because we were so close at the time, but Todoroki seemed more aware of his hate being unnatural than Ida or Bakugo were. That's what tipped Kami off about the curse to begin with, and it was then that we realized it was probably the reason behind Bakugo's actions at the end of the training exercise. He didn't want to look at Aizawa's face after that. Quite frankly, he was afraid of what Aizawa might say. He knew where the man was coming from. Kami had felt the same way, but Midori couldn't, in good conscience, allow Bakugo to be expelled for something that wasn't his fault. If he had, then Todoroki deserved the same for trying to kill him during the sports festival. It was an agonizingly painful shade of gray. If your theory about this curse is true, I can't see any fault with it so far. Aizawa hesitated for a moment. And what you did was completely logical. I don't agree personally, but I agree logically. The sigh of relief that escaped Midori's chest couldn't have been louder, but suddenly Aizawa snapped toward Nezu, who sat cheekily on the edge of his desk, swinging his legs. What I don't understand, Nezu, is how you could deny his expulsion anyway. You had no knowledge of a curse or anything that could have impaired Bakugo's judgment other than him merely making a rash and spiteful decision. You should have followed protocol. What he did was expulsion-worthy. But if Nezu had any remorse over his previous actions, he did not express it. I had heard Midoriya's testimony before I made my decision, he simply stated. And it swayed me against protocol. Midoriya and Bakugo's dynamic. It sparked my curiosity, and if I were to have had Bakugo expelled, then development such as this could have been lost to my knowledge. Aizawa lurched forward aggressively. You can't keep doing this. You can't put students at risk and ignore protocol just because you feel like it. The rodent's carefree attitude seemed to fade away for just a second, replaced by this look of sternness that sparked an unusual fear in Midoriya's chest. I'm not putting anyone at risk. I have everything under control, and I have been monitoring Bakugo's development since that incident. The tone in his voice left no room for arguments, and it's why Midoriya's heart skipped a beat as Nezu's beady eyes had turned back to him. Which reminds me, I believe the entire reason you're sharing this with us is because of what occurred after class today. Midoriya couldn't stop the shudder that ran down his spine. I take back any praise I gave the rat. His anger shifting to worry, Aizawa turned to Midoriya again. What happened? Well, I believe I can shed light on that, Nezu interrupted, pulling out his phone from his pocket. With a few quick taps, he found what he was looking for, and noticeably upped the volume. You were never supposed to be here. Midoriya visibly flinched, not expecting to hear Bakugo's voice play out over the speaker. You weren't supposed to get a quirk, and even though you did, you should know that what you have was never meant to save anyone. His discomfort began to blossom out of control. Did Nezu have the classroom bugged on top of videotaped? How much had he heard? How much did he hear? Get out of my head. I want nothing to do with you or your shitty quirk. I can't even bear to look at you, and it's really trying my goddamn nerves, shitrag. Gami knew it wasn't really Bakugo talking, but it still took everything he had to catch the growl that threatened to escape him. Let me tell you, you fill me with nothing but hate, a pathetic excuse for a human being. Midoriya winced at hearing that again. Gami held him closer. This is all your fault. You and your fucking quirk. I want nothing to do with you, so stop fucking with me. How Bakugo had known, he had no idea, but it really was all his fault. He didn't mean for the curse to exist, but that meant nothing to the people it had affected. I'll annihilate you. I'm going to fucking murder you. Then Nezu clicked the recording off. Midoriya hastily brushed his building tears away, so that he could immediately turn to Aizawa with as much confidence as he could muster. Look, I know how awful it sounds, but that's the same kind of thing Todoroki and Ida said to me when they were being affected by the curse. And if Bakugo really was being affected by my curse during the battle training incident, I never got to break him out of it like I had to with Todoroki and Ida to get them back to normal. He had to stop under the weight of his own words, even though he already knew what was coming next. Bakugo is still being affected by it. He has been since that day, and it's possible that someone can be influenced by my curse for such a long period of time. Then there's a possibility he's been affected since before the battle training incident, even before coming to UA. Aizawa's eyes narrowed, but that didn't stop the clear nervousness that radiated through them. You two, you were friends in childhood, right? Really close friends, until I was diagnosed, he confirmed. I thought it was just because of my diagnosis, since all the other kids treated me the same, but... Aizawa cursed under his breath. Nezu, who'd been trapped in his thought the whole time, tapped a paw at his chin. Wouldn't that also open up that same possibility with your mother? Midoriya's heart sank to the bottom of his stomach like lead in water. What? You said your mother changed quite drastically after your father left, Nezu reiterated, unaware or uncaring of the way Midoriya's face morphed in horror. Therefore, there is the possibility that her sudden hatred for you was also the work of your curse. It made sense. He'd always assumed that his father just snapped when he found out he was quirkless, and he'd always assumed that his mother just snapped when his father left. It made sense in the moment that being quirkless was like a death sentence. He just thought his parents couldn't deal with it. But what Nezu was saying made sense, too. He never thought to question the reasons behind his parents' actions, because he never had any idea that some curse could be at play. His father burned him. His mother... Oh, God. His mother was arrested. She could go to prison. All because of his curse. His hands shook uncontrollably. All because of him. Oh, God. God, it's all my fault. Someone grabbed his shoulders. Midoriya, you can't assume that. You don't know what the reason was, and regardless, she did something unacceptable. But the teen couldn't hear him over his overwhelming shower of guilt. It's all my fault. His words were cut off by the erupting of vomit that came from his throat, and all into the trash can that was suddenly at his feet. How it got there, he didn't care. He was just thankful it didn't get all over Nezu's carpet instead. He missed Aizawa thinking Kami over the sounds of his own puking. There wasn't much for him to throw up since he'd already expelled most of it earlier in the bathroom, but it still felt like an eternity before Midoriya finally stopped hacking. Aizawa had a box of tissues ready for him, and Midoriya was just grateful to be able to wipe the shame from his face. Midoriya, I need you to look at me. Anxiously, the teen looked up, face blotchy and red from tears that he couldn't stop and throat raw from the guilt that he couldn't contain. He made note that Aizawa's hands were still clasped tightly onto his shoulders, but he couldn't bring himself to try and shake them off. In fact, it just made him want to be pulled in more. I'm sorry that you've had to do this on your own this whole time. There was something soft in Aizawa's eyes, but Midoriya couldn't quite see it through his blurry tears. But I promise you'll never have to do it alone again. Nezu nodded. Should Aizawa ever fall victim to your curse, you can come right here. Aizawa, royally tired of Nezu's bullshit, sent a nasty glare over to the principal, one which Gami joined in on, but otherwise he did not say a word, opting to bring Midoriya closer in his arms. We'll figure this all out together, I promise. Gami joined in the hug from behind, effectively squishing his successor in a double embrace. He was worried he might be intruding on a moment not meant for him, but once he heard him laugh through his sobs, all he could think about was holding him tighter. Midoriya did laugh, choked out this pain laugh of relief, of guilt. But it was enough to make him smile, however small it was. He was really lucky, painfully so. Someone like him was never meant to feel love like this, but here it was. His tears died down, so he pulled away to wipe the last remnants away from his sleeve. If there's anything else Nezu needs to mention, I'm sure he can do so later. Aizawa stood up, placing the box of tissues on the couch where he sat. Let's go home. And that was enough to bring Midoriya to his feet, both of them missing anything that Nezu did manage to say as they left the confining atmosphere of his office. We forgot to talk to him about the hat. Gami chuckled, running his fingers through the boy's hair. Midoriya laughed, holding tightly onto Kami's hand as he kept up his pace so Aizawa would stay on his shoulder. I don't care. All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 44 of Deku and Death. Chapter 45 will be next. Hope you all are still enjoying it as always. Thank you so much for listening.